our presenter is the CEO of Justice Informed, a social impact consulting firm based in Chicago. And I would love for you to give a warm and grand welcome to Xavier Ramey as he takes the stage. Glad you're here.
Thank you. What's up, y'all? Yeah, it's gonna be that casual. I'm here out of the joy that I have as a black man in America in the time that we are in today. I'm here out of the joy and the appreciation that I have for all who came before me. And I'm also here to shout out the best city in the country, Chicago. Yeah. Y'all, New York's not on stage right now. My name is Xavier Ramey. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of a social impact consulting firm. It's called Justice Informed. We are based in the city of Chicago, but I am blessed to say that we're able to work coast to coast and increasingly globally. Many of the challenges of diversity, equity, inclusion, and corporate social responsibility and philanthropy and community engagements are ones that my team takes on every single day, but we take it on with a bit of nuance. And I'm going to share a bit of that nuance with you all today, but I'm also going to be inviting you all to it. I'm going to be inviting you all to a challenge of pace, a challenge of urgency, a question not just of the path you want to take, but the pace towards it. We live in a world today where there are many people who spout off words like anti-racism without knowing clearly what it means, without a framework or level of rigor that any person of color would ever say is enough or sufficient, not only to ensure their empowerment for the future, but to reclaim what has been lost in the past. We throw around the term accountability without understanding how accountability works in time, to both conceptualize the acknowledgement of what has happened, to repair and to reparate what has happened in the past, but also to turn around the solutions that we're looking towards in the future. And in that, we come to the word tradition. In the business world and with many of our clients, we use the word practices. I hear many people use the term best practices. Raise your hand if you hear that all the time. Best practice. What's the best practice? Tell me what's the best practice for combating racism in America? What's the best practice for having a conscientious conversation about racial equity in the workplace? What's the best practice for bringing someone along in the conversation around a powerful DEI that is approached through the lens of racial equity with someone who is still trying to figure out how come they've got a black employee resource group but not a white one? Who knows how to have that conversation with the confidence, the competency, and the capacity to actually drive change forward? This is the state of our sector. This is the product of our labor. This is the best of our practices in action. It is the silence of the ideas that have yet to come forward. And so I want to challenge you all up front. I'm not going to talk about best practices. I'm going to talk about new practices. There are no best practices. We've never lived in an anti-racist world. We don't live in a country that even has a singular definition or understanding of racial equity. None of us works in a company where the gender pay gap is still not something of conversation. Many of us don't even know how to face our families as it relates to conversations of identity as it pertains to LGBTQIA persons. Many of us work in companies where they demand diversity, equity, inclusion, and we go back and self-segregate the city ourselves. So what is the value of what we're saying? What is the value of what we keep looking back to find? The value is ahead of us. At Justice Informed, one of the things that we focus on is the power of words. Y'all have heard me spout off a lot of words already. I study words. I love words. This is my 20th year being on stage talking about racial equity in America. I know I don't look like it. That's just shea butter, good hydration. I know what I did this morning when I woke up. I woke up just like this. The power of words. The power of words. What do words do? They create ideas in the mind. Those ideas in the mind may be different depending on who you're talking about and the experiences they've had in the world. Their biases are filtering these words and informing the ideas that come from them. And those ideas then shape narratives. Narratives that you can believe or not believe. But those narratives are what allow for strategies. I run a social impact consulting firm. I care about strategies. We sell strategies, but they start with words. They come out of the ideas that people have about those words, that then create narratives in the world that we either have to fight against, figure out a go-forward strategy for, or we can move quickly through towards the strategies that are actually determined by the urgency with which people of color need change, not by the fears of people who don't understand why it's important for them to be a part of it as well. The pace of racial change in America can no longer move at the pace of white fragility. Hard stop. You see, it is the fragilities of those who have privilege who often set the pace for progress. That is fundamentally the challenge of power. This is why it is important for everyone to recognize their own power, to recognize their own privileges. Some of these powers and privileges are ones that we are born with. Some of them are assumed over time. I was born in the North Lawndale neighborhood in Chicago. If you've ever read Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, that is the neighborhood I grew up in. It was the one that stimulated him to author such a piece, to talk about what is the claim for reparations in America. It is defined by this experience even in this small neighborhood on the west side of the city, the one I grew up in. I can tell you about the plunder and the pillage. I could give you the data points around how much we lost as it relates to mortgages over time, the amount of loss that was experienced from 1960 up until the time of the passing of the Community Reinvestment Act in 1977. I'd give you all the data points. But what's more important than the data points? What matters to the people who are the data points? That change happens. I don't care how much you measure it. I care how much my cousins feel it. I don't care whether you can bring your employees and coworkers along. I care how many more burials I have to go to. I care whether it matters to the young men that I work with still on the west side of Chicago, the burials that I go to for people who never even saw 18. That is what our DEI strategies, our CSR strategies should be preventing. It should be making our ancestors proud. That's what it should be doing. Let's go back to the words. Why don't the strategies have more power to them? Why don't they engage a more rigorous form of equity? I'm going to offer up a quote from a person that I respect incredibly. His name was James Baldwin. James Baldwin was an author, an artist, I would say a street theologian. He was an incredible man who, in many ways, authored an acknowledgement of America that we still have yet to reckon with today. If you've never read any of his books, I suggest you start with the book called The Fire Next Time. But in one of his pieces of writing, he said, if you want to know what justice is in America, you don't ask a police officer. You don't ask a lawyer. You don't ask a judge. He says, ask any Mexican. Ask a black man. Ask a queer person how they fare in the halls of justice. And then you will know, not whether or not a country is just, but whether it has any love for it or a concept of it at all. And he said, it is clear in any case that ignorance allied with power is the greatest threat that justice can ever have. So what happens when we find ourselves in a time where leaders are being held responsible for a thing they have still not yet accepted the power of, being held responsible for racial progress as it relates to representation inside their companies, but they still don't know how to have that conversation with their child? One of the most dangerous things you can be is to be in power and to need to learn something about how to use it. To be before people who need change and to know that the words that you understand and the ideas you have about them and the narratives you were taught to believe do not give you the authenticity, the credibility, or the knowledge to drive powerful strategies forward for equity. That is what it means to be in our time today, y'all. Every single person in here, if you are here because Yemi invited you or Bethany invited you or anyone from the OfColor team invited you or you are a supporter, a stakeholder, an investor, or just someone who walked in off the street and was like, I just want to be on a rooftop penthouse today. Hey, they got the Andre in the back. Then I'm going to assume that you want more. I'm going to assume that. And so I'm going to speak to you all, and I'm going to continue speaking out of what it takes to want more. To want more is to call for different work. All different work is more work. All more work is tiring work. For any of you all who have been trying to figure out how do we crack the nut of the lack of wealth equity that we have for people of color in America, you know it's hard to even figure out what a potential strategy forward could be. You know it's hard. Anyone who's tried to raise a round of capital under the promise of equity, and I'm not talking about financial equity, social equity in the world, you know it's hard. Anyone who's ever tried to push a DEI strategy forward out of their business resource group or employee resource group, and someone comes in and says, well, what's the business case for diversity? It's hard. And for many of us, particularly those who are people of color, it is a cost to even be the persons in the room who have to hear someone say, but why should we do it? The incredible mental cost and psychological cost, the emotional cost, the generational cost. The challenge of being the material cost of progress. I want to encourage you to also know that you're the value. There is a cost to this work. The fatigue you feel, the challenges you face, the constantly going back to the beginning of your work to say, they shot it down again. They shot it down again. How do we go back up this mountain and convince these people that this is important? That incredible cost is redeemed by the value of us continuing to be the authors of the progress and the pace for it. One of the greatest challenges I think we face right now is that we're in a time where we need to create better strategies around DEI, but there is a pushback against even measuring equity, of it being a personal corporate concern. Earlier today, we talked about this question of how can businesses be more accountable? How can we understand their level of accountability as it relates to their social costs versus their financial costs and profits, right? We know that a business is evaluated on the basis of the returns that it has. Profit is what? Revenues minus costs. And they're evaluated on that basis. But we also know that many of the things the government is being asked to take up, from the conversation we had earlier today about employee benefits and healthcare, when we only have that question because health is not a human right in America. That is why we have employee benefits that are employer sponsored, because health itself is not a human right in this country. The reason why we have conversations around the unbanked and the underbanked and these sorts of things is because financial security is a nice to have. But all of this goes back to the very beginning of our business model. My own background is in economics. That is what I went to school to study for. I started actually as a commodities trader at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. I went over to the social justice space. I got radicalized a little bit, went on a couple marches. It was rough. I stopped going to white people church. It was hard. But the thing that you realize when you're doing all of this work is the powerful return on investment when you know that if the work gets done, your own life gets better. If we actually did it together, if we did this work more rigorously, if we refused to use words like diversity, say, well, we're looking for more diverse candidates. What does that mean? What does that really mean? You just mean like not white people? You just mean like not dudes? What do you really mean by that? Let's be specific about these words. Let's be specific about these words to continually put the issue at hand up front. And in that specificity, people can't negotiate their way out of the reality of what they continue to relegate and delegate to others as it relates to their responsibilities to being part of the solutions of inequity. By being consistent with our specificity. The reason why I have used the word white and black and brown and LGBTQ and queer specifically is because we have to get specific. Some people are afraid to say these words in their workplaces. I offer up this. It's only weird if you say it once. It only sounds crazy if you say it one time. Keep saying it. Consistency is a shield. Eventually, it's your reputation. The first time I started talking about anti-racism, I was booed off the stage. The first time I tried to get one of our clients to consider our own definition for anti-racism, which is three-part. It's actually built out of the Kingian Institute for Nonviolent Studies, coupled with some of the literature and work around critical race theory. But it starts with this active confrontation towards global militarization. How do you have that conversation in the Fortune 500? Around global militarization and their commitments to it. We have that conversation in Fortune 500s. To those who say it's not possible, I tell you it is. Anti-racism requires an active confrontation against white supremacy. It requires the naming of it. To those who say you can't talk about white supremacy, to massive foundation philanthropists, yes, you can. We do it all the time. I serve as executive advisor now to one of the largest non-governmental funders on the planet. And he listens to it all the time. It's how we ended up creating a reparations fund around the global Black diaspora in the last 2 years for $40 million. As just a start, as a pilot program. Yes, we can. Anti-racism requires an active confrontation as it relates to the challenges of hyper-capitalism. But many people who would hear the word hyper-capitalism, and if you've actually studied economics, you know that that's a Marxist term. That's not simply a capitalistic term. No one, Adam Smith never said that. Marx said that. It was in Das Kapital. But I know that because I've studied it, because I grew up in a capitalist country, and I studied economics, and when I took that degree home, back to North Lawndale, the only thing it taught me how to do was how to profit off my own people. That's all it taught me. And so from the beginning of this standardization of knowledge, this credential, I realized it had nothing to do with seeing me. It had to do with my ability to become a pirate and future philanthropist. This is the challenge of the conversation around equity and growth in wealth as well, of just being around accumulation. And the importance of us all creating these wage opportunities allow for individual Black persons, individual brown persons to increase their individual wealth. But the reality is we need more solidarity within all of us. We all need to be together as it relates to the question around labor. How does this show up? If I just talked about anti-racism a little bit earlier. For example, at Justice Informed, when we look at traditional capitalist economic theory, we know that there are 4 factors of production. I'm gonna get into the weeds a little bit. One is land. The returns to land is rents. Another factor of production, meaning a tool of ownership, is capital. The returns to capital is interest. Another factor of production is labor. The returns to labor is wages. But the other factor of production is entrepreneurship, a newer one that came around significantly further after the fall of the mercantile empire, these sorts of things. Entrepreneurship has no direct return that has any cap to it. You know, if you have an interest rate of 400%, someone's going to say that's predatory. There's no term for a 400-to-1 wage ratio in corporate America. There's no term, there's no term for what that actually is and what that produces if it were negative. It was a negative issue in society, so there's no cap on entrepreneurship. But if I have a commitment to anti-racism, and I define that partly as a commitment to confront the practices as it relates to capital production, as well as capital accumulation, then it requires that I, as a CEO, consider what is my responsibility to solidarity with all classes of people, not just entrepreneurs. And so it's one of the reasons why we have a 1-to-5 wage cap at Justice Informed. No person can make more than 5 times the base wage of the lowest paid employee. It creates an incredible conversation in my own mind about what I'm owed, about what I deserve, about what is mine. As it relates to culture, no policy can be authored in the company that does not involve the people it most affects. I can't write a parental leave policy myself. It has to be authored with women. It has to be co-signed by queer persons. There's a disaggregation of power that is required for the modern business to move sustainably. That sustainability is beyond and significantly further than the SDGs. That conversation is one that is not just about the workplace. Like I said, people demand diversity, equity, inclusion at work, but they go home and they segregate their own cities. They demand at work, they don't live. They value at work, they don't embody. This is a daily act. This is a consistent work. It permeates everything when it's done right. And it requires that we loosen our grips around best practices and stop looking at what other businesses are doing and say, what has business never done? We're a for-profit company. When I heard the value proposition that Yemi was proposing, when he said, let's get specific. Let's get specific about employee benefits. Let's get specific about that. I know that the chief HR officers that I talk to all the time are struggling under the challenge of what I often tell them when they first sign a contract with Justice Informed, and I tell the chief HR officer and I tell their general counsel, usually we meeting at the same time, I am sorry to say that we're going to be at odds with one another for some time. Because equity is often something that is separate from the law. Sometimes it's actually illegal to do what's right. Sometimes it's unpopular to do what's right. I remind them that in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, that should not have been a signal to business to start treating people fairly. That the businesses that existed in 1963 could have moved without the government before it was popular. Again, while they looked for best practices, people like my mother needed new practices. They didn't need businesses to say, what are others doing? They needed business to say, what has not been done that is ours to do? Not how can we be general, how can we be specific? How do we harness the power of specificity? Specificity is a power, y'all. It really is. Choosing, as Baldwin also said, to choose is to be in a state of danger. You are now separating yourself from what is okay, what is normal, what is safe, what is accepted. And you're moving a little bit ahead of the pack. But in that, you also see the opportunity for standardization. This is why in 2017, when I started Justice Informed, I did it when I did it, because I've been waiting for what I call a genesis moment. A moment where there's a moment in time to start something new, not just to create something, but to create a new definition. And when launching Justice Informed, the mantra was, we are changing the face of expertise. How many of you all have worked on social equity projects or social impact projects over the last several years? And when you bring in the people who are the thought leaders, they don't look anything like some of us. How many hours have you spent teaching and training people who would never live in your neighborhood about your neighborhood? And then they sell that information back to the client at $500 an hour. How much waste? How much time when we knew the answers ourselves already? What informs us? If it's profit, it's not justice. If it's power, it's not justice. If it's non-specific, it's not justice. If it's fear, it's not justice. If it's fragility, it's not justice. As Baldwin said, we have to turn the evaluation around and the right to it to the people who need it the most. And we start by asking them. But we let them define, was it equity? Was it CSR? Was it impact? Was it truly measurable? As I said to the students at the University of Chicago when I first started working there, leading their social innovation and philanthropy strategy, you were going to study a lot of things at this university. Chicago is one of the most studied cities in the entire world. North Lawndale is one of the most studied and researched neighborhoods in this country. I promise you, while you hold these things as theories, the data point is talking to you right now. And you've got to decide. You've got to decide whether what you read in the book is real or what is speaking to you that has survived what they didn't write is real. That's the question. And so when we start to author the strategies, when the people of color start to author the strategies that affect us, we'll start with different words. I would never say diverse communities. I would say the exact race that's in them. If I mean women, I say women. If I mean non-binary people, I say that. I don't conflate it. I get specific about words. If I mean justice, I mean justice. If I mean equity, I mean equity. If I mean diversity, I mean diversity. I mean exactly what I say. And that specificity of words would allow for an idea in the mind and the continual representation of that idea and that consistency. The ideas could be powerful. Imagine if when we started with the words black and boy, the idea that came to people's minds wasn't one of danger, which then turned into a narrative of criminality, which then allowed for a strategy of policing. What if the words black and boy created the idea of neighbor and misunderstood, to then create a narrative of provision and resource that then allows for a strategy of the sustainable sharing and interdependence of a government and corporate model that allows for human rights to be about the very body rather than the continuance of the body to be a human privilege. Words, ideas, narratives, strategies. People come to me all the time and they say, how do we start a diversity, equity, inclusion strategy? That's never the first question. The first question is, will you do it if I told you? I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, y'all's DEI assessments and audits are too rigorous. You're doing too much. You're doing too much. Ask a black man. I don't think I'm doing enough. Again, who owns the right to say what impact is? Who gets to say whether it's rigorous enough? The person who needs it. I need the work to move at the pace of my ambitions, not the pace of your fear. I need the work to move out of the promise of what needs to be redeemed and reclaimed. We need to live in a world where we don't keep saying and clapping for firsts. We need to understand the burden of what it means to be first, to be the leader. Over the last several years, y'all have seen how many black women have moved into these chief diversity officer roles. I'm saying on behalf of the tears I see them crying behind doors when they're working with me as their advisor, it is breaking many of them. It is hurting many of them to carry this as a lonely only, to carry it with the hope of being a servant leader, to pass some of the returns to their power back downstream. They don't want to be bosses. They want to be leaders. Leaders take the first hit. Bosses take the first cut. There's a difference. They want to lead, and it has a cost, but they know they have a value, and so they stay. But we need to wrap around them with specificity. We need to wrap around them with consistency. We need to wrap around them as they are in many ways the face of a lot of this work right now. And we have to be specific about that. We have to be rigorous about that. The pace of change has to move at the pace of what? The ambitions. The ambitions that we have, not the pace of fear. Fear is where you say, in the face of what I see, I have no power. And I'm saying this now out of my faith. You're also saying God has no power. I believe that that is not the right of any person to say, that nothing is possible. As I said, we live in an era where you can talk about hypercapitalism and white supremacy and demilitarization in a Fortune 500. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how. How do you do it? That's what I wish and hope more people would come and ask us at JI. Like, how do you do that? Not if you can do that. You can. The partners exist. The people exist. Talking to a chief financial officer of a Fortune 500 just a couple weeks ago, as he said, Xavier, I was really fired up around, the last 2 years, what happened when George Floyd was killed and all of this momentum. I feel like it's dwindling, and I want to really get the company back on track as it relates to this conversation around, like, how can we be an anti-racist company? This is a 50, 60-year-old white man. I don't look at him as an enemy. I don't look at him as antagonistic. I look to see whether he wants to be a partner with our pace. And so I offered to him, sure, there's some ways. Can I look at your security contracts? He looked at me like, what? What does looking at security contracts have to do with any of this? I said, well, you know that George died for many reasons. But one of the reasons why he died was because of the level and type of bias that exists in the conversation around security. I can zoom us out and have a social justice conversation about the difference between safety and security. Security happens because you are protecting property, often with a gun or some level of force. But safety comes from the interconnected network of relationships that we have and the social contracts that we continue to require upon one another. Safety is the presence of powerful relationships. Security is the presence of powerful weaponry. There is a difference. And so if you want to create safety in your plants, from Indianapolis to Pakistan, you have to stop looking at security. You have to start looking at the conversation around what within your contracts are actually about creating safety, what within the ways in which you are paying your workers actually create a space where their financial safety, their financial opportunities, create their ability to move themselves out of challenges that may put them into violence's way. Now, many people would think that that would never fly. It flew. It flew. You have conversations with people such as, some of my friends in academia, where they say, hey, the academy is a tough place to start a conversation about powerful racial equity. You get into conversations with faculty. Any of y'all ever talk to faculty about whether the research that they did was racist? Whether the PhD and everything that they studied and proved in those thesis statements was actually, housed under the veil of white supremacy and these sorts of things. Whether any authors of color were part of their research sampling. Y'all ever had? That's a tough conversation. That is not an easy conversation. It has nothing to do with logic. It has to do with pride. You don't want to think that you are a part of something bad. That has nothing to do with logic. That is just a person's sense of self. And so engaging it as an advisor, I have to deal with people on the reality of the basis that they're usually having an emotional reaction to a logical conversation. But many people would say it's impossible to further a conversation about these things around, for instance, white supremacy in the academy. Is it? Or is it about how we're doing it? Northwestern University in Chicago, one of the top 10 universities here in the US, called us up. They said, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's do it with our 300 senior most leaders. We'll bring the provost, the dean, the president, all of them. We'll give you days at a time with all of them. Create a standard definition. Change our words. Because we keep talking about business resource groups, and we keep talking about employee resource groups, and we keep talking about strategies, and we keep facing resistance. Standardize the language so that we can create space for the strategies. And you would think that that'd be impossible. I'm telling you, it's possible. It's possible. It's happening. Progress is happening. Not at the pace of change that I want, but at a pace of change that we can do something with. So I invite all of you to consider where your work is, where your space is in all of that. One of the professors there, I lead classes sometimes with her name is Suzanne Muchin. She has this really powerful saying. It's 3 parts. The first part is, what is yours? What is yours? What is within your power? What is within your control? What is within your identity? What is yours to do? Of all the things that can be done, what are yours to do in this world? In the time we're living in right now, what do you have? And with it, what is possible in this time? That's why I look at even my age. I look at the energy I have. I'm not gonna have this energy forever. I know how many sounds my dad made when he got up out of bed every morning. This energy ain't gonna last. I know that, and I'm 6'5". You ever seen tall old dudes? Like, I know what these knees about to do. I ain't got Megan's knees. I don't have time to act like I got time. Going back to urgency, going back to pace, which means that as we talk about strategies, we still have to be training up a new generation of people to take our place. That's the work, y'all. Imagine if you did the work of racial equity with joy, not with fear, not with apprehension. Imagine if you did it with joy. How would you do it? How would you understand what is yours? to do in this world without fully seeing yourself. I have to look at everything I am and say, what of this can benefit the world? Bethany, when we first met, we didn't know what was going to happen the next week. When a week before the whole nation shut down because of COVID-19, I'm down in Atlanta with Bethany, and we're talking about these things around DEI and a faster pace, and then the whole world's pace slowed down. And all of the confusion around shelter in place and unemployment and these things started to cripple our conversations. And what did we see in that moment? A bit of a call to community. Y'all remember the early days of the pandemic when we were a little bit together? Y'all remember that? People were marching for nurses in New York. Y'all remember that? We were together. But why were we together? Because we were all feeling pain. Now, why must pain be the only thing that brings us together? What if joy brought us together? What if a commitment to one another brought us together? What if we use words like love when we talked about diversity, equity, inclusion? What if we didn't say financial empowerment, we said safety? What if we didn't use words like independence, we used words like interdependent? Where we didn't look at support for another person as a lack of ability to provide for oneself. This is a wholesale reimagining of language of community. That's what I'm asking you all to consider and what that can mean for you. But I'm also asking you to consider that without assuming that these words are for here. I don't use those words at work. These words are not for my clients. I can't talk about it that way with them. Because I'm standing here and I'm saying, as a black man in America who grew up on a $20 a week budget for our entire house of 6 people for food every week, who knows what that government cheese tastes like, who grew up on them Farina bowls, who lived right over down the street from them Cabrini Green projects that y'all read about, who survived a thing that did not destroy me. There's more. There's more. And the more starts with a joyous acceptance of the call to equity, to seeing it as an invitation to more accountable relationships that in many ways this country says we already have. Where one nation actually has to be that. Where the conversation around a 21st century company can't just be about giving back, it has to be about not taking first. That's the work that we have together. I'm going to leave y'all with this. I've talked about specificity. And the reason why I'm not going to leave here without a shameless plug for the OfColor team is because what I love the most about disrupting this discourse, shifting away from business speak, casual, general terms to more specific, urgent terms, is that the very nature of what they're trying to accomplish is to get specific. I don't know if any of y'all have ever tried to talk to, chief HR officers or HR directors and these sorts of folks who've been trained up in the traditional business practices around employee benefits negotiations, et cetera. I spent a lot of time in those rooms, and it is very hard to talk about getting specific about what a benefit should be for wages conferred. It is very hard to get specific about racial differences. It is very hard to do that. And that's because the very ways in which we construct laws often require a standardization of effect. But I want to offer this. Where harm is specific, the solution needs to be as well. Where the harm is specific, the solution needs to be as well. And when you're talking about the question of what does it mean when we know that the data shows that in predominantly black communities, women are more often than not the heads of households, but we also couple that with the data that we see around pay inequity as it relates to racialization of women in the workplace, the reality that the Equal Pay Act of 1963 still has not been made true. Then we know that black and brown women are taking home less dollars first. Those dollars are going to more hands second. And they are still not being supported by a substantial fully resourced ecosystem of sustainable social services when they're in those communities, because we know those communities are often less funded than ones that are not Black and brown. When we know all of this is happening, and then someone comes in and says, let's get specific. Let's get specific. Let's get specific about that, about how we empower them, how we identify them, how we name them, and let's move forward. I'm with it. I'm with it. Short and sweet, I'm with it. From the west side of Chicago, on behalf of the west side, I'm with it. I'm glad you all are here because I'm assuming you are as well. And so I want to thank the OfColor team. Yemi, can we please give a round of applause to this man? Anything that is getting specific is getting urgent. And anything that is choosing is in danger. If they're choosing and they're getting specific and they're getting urgent, we need to protect it. We need to rally around it. We need to resource it. The moment I named my company Justice Informed, I started seeing a lot of people disappear. I know what it means to try to run out front with specific language. And trying to build that over time to get to where we are now. I know what the data is about the number of, $1 million companies that Black people create in the city of Chicago. It's less than 5% of all businesses. But we made it. I know what it feels like when you're talking to people who want to put money into your company, but they're like, yeah, but just lose the edge. And say, we ain't smoothing nothing out. On behalf of Harriet, we ain't smoothing it out. We ain't doing it. Why? Because it's time. It's time for that urgency. It's time for that specificity. It's time for that joy. It's time for that specificity. It's time for that urgency. It's time for that joy. Y'all keep them 3 words. I'm gonna keep repeating them until y'all walk out of here like specificity, urgency, and joy. I remember that. Like y'all gonna walk away with that. Because when you go out into this big city that so many people around the world are trying to get to, and if you don't walk out of there today with a level of specificity, a level of urgency, and a level of joy, you did it wrong. You did it wrong. You missed the whole thing. I'm gonna leave y'all with that. And I thank you for your time. I challenge you all to take up the work too. To do it with
Specificity, urgency, and
Let's get it. Let's get it. Let's get it. Woo! Come on.